Tom took admission in a new school when my father was transferred. But the new school is nothing as it seems. Something is always looking at me, and then one day the first day at my new school felt like an endless blur. We had just moved to a small house in the suburbs after my father's transfer, and I wasn't exactly thrilled about leaving behind my old friends, my old school, and the familiar streets of the city. But my father had promised it would only be for a while, just a few years at most. Still, it didn't make the idea of a new school and new people any less daunting. I was nervous as we arrived at the school, a large, imposing building with a mix of old brick and glass windows. The kind of school that looked like it had been around forever, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had seen more than its fair share of secrets. After the usual awkward introductions, I was assigned to Class 5. The teacher, Mrs. Adams, was kind enough, but there was a strange coldness in the air. She gave me a brief tour of the classroom, where the other kids were already seated, whispering and glancing over at the new kid. But what really caught my attention was the back of the room. There was a door, an old wooden door, half hidden behind a shelf of textbooks. It was locked, and Mrs. Adams didn't go near it. "That's off limits," she said, her voice a little too quick. A little too firm. I didn't think much of it at the time. But something about that door stayed with me. The first few weeks at the new school were uneventful. I tried to adjust to the routine, the new faces, and the unfamiliar surroundings. But the classroom, it was different. There was something odd about it. The air always felt thick, almost like it was heavier than usual. And every time I sat near that old wooden door at the back of the room, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, even on the warmest days. It wasn't just me. A couple of the other kids seemed to avoid that part of the classroom too. Some would glance at it nervously when Mrs. Adams wasn't looking, and there were whispers, hushed conversations that stopped when I came too close. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I could tell there was something wrong with that room. Then came the night that changed everything. I had stayed late after school to finish some homework. The halls were quiet, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I had to use the bathroom, so I stood up from my desk and headed toward the door. As I walked past the back of the classroom, I saw something strange out of the corner of my eye. The door, the locked door, was slightly ajar. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. No one had ever mentioned that door being opened, and there was no way I could explain it. My curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly walked over to it, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob, but just as I was about to push the door open, a voice from behind me stopped me cold. "Tom, don't go in there." I spun around. It was Mrs. Adams. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with what I could only describe as fear. "Sure. Here's an expanded version of Chapter 3, the changes begin in Chapter 4, the teacher's concern." These chapters dive deeper into Tom's descent into a supernatural possession and the growing tension at school. Let's explore the changes he's going through and the increasing worry of those around him. The first few days after that moment with Mrs. Adams and the locked door were strange. It was like something in the air had shifted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first. I didn't notice anything too drastic, but there was an odd heaviness that seemed to settle over me. I began to lose focus in class. I would look up at the board and see the words, but they felt distant, as though I were watching them through a fog. Mrs. Adams had asked me if I was feeling okay, but I just nodded and said I was tired. Honestly, though, I didn't know how to explain it. I felt off, like something was slowly pulling me into a place I didn't want to go. It wasn't just the schoolwork or the lessons that were affected. My whole body seemed to be in a constant state of discomfort. I had trouble sleeping, even though I was exhausted all the time. Every night, I'd fall asleep with a sense of dread creeping over me, only to wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. It felt like something was lurking in the dark corners of my room, waiting for me to close my eyes. It started with little things. One day, during recess, I was playing soccer with some of the other kids when I suddenly snapped at David, a kid who'd been friendly to me. He had passed the ball to me, and I had kicked it too hard, sending it across the field. He tried to laugh it off, saying I'd kicked it way too hard, but for some reason, that small comment sent me over the edge. "Shut up, David," I snapped, glaring at him. "You're not even any good at soccer." The words left my mouth before I could stop them. His face fell, and the other kids just stared at me. I could feel the anger boiling inside me, rage that wasn't even mine. I quickly apologized, feeling bad. I had no idea where the anger had come from, but it was like something had taken control for a moment, and then, just as quickly as it had come, it faded. I couldn't explain it, and David didn't seem to know what had happened either. Over the next few days, I started noticing that I couldn't remember things as clearly. I'd forget where I left my books or lose track of conversations I had just had. My head felt foggy, and I started hearing things. Not voices, exactly, but whispers, soft, almost like a murmur from far away. I'd hear my name being called, and when I turned around, no one was there. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was just stress from the move, or maybe the change in schools was finally catching up with me. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to get louder at night, more urgent. The voices felt like they were beckoning me, pulling me towards something. I tried to ignore it. But every night, the whispers came back, growing louder and more distinct. I could hear them saying things, dark things, things that didn't make sense but felt real. "You belong to me," the whispers would hiss. "Come to the door." The last phrase repeated itself so often, I couldn't shake the image of that locked door at the back of the classroom. The place where the darkness had first shown itself to me. It was like someone, was trying to draw me in, to claim me. And I couldn't figure out why. It wasn't just the whispers that unsettled me. There was something more sinister going on. I could feel an oppressive weight on my chest, as if I was being suffocated. Every time I walked past the door at the back of the room, I felt the cold air touch my skin, even though the room was warm. The presence was unmistakable, like I was being watched. But the strangest part was that no one else seemed to notice. I began avoiding the door whenever I could, but it felt like it was calling me, and each time I ignored it, the pull grew stronger. It was almost as if whatever was behind it knew I was resisting, and it became angrier. It was about a week after the strange incidents had started when Mrs. Adams pulled me aside after class. The entire lesson, I had been staring blankly at the board, not really absorbing anything. The numbers and words on the page began to blur, and I had to blink rapidly to refocus. I had been so wrapped up in the strange sensations I'd been feeling, the darkness inside me, that I hadn't realized Mrs. Adams was watching me closely. She must have sensed something was off. "Tom," she said softly, her voice cutting through my fog. I looked up to meet her concerned gaze. "Could you stay behind for a moment? I need to talk to you." My heart sank. I knew what this was about. My behavior had been getting worse, snapping at my classmates. Zoning out during lessons, forgetting things. The teacher had started noticing the strange shifts in my mood, and I knew I couldn't hide it much longer. I walked to the front of the classroom, trying to push down the rising panic. As I sat down, Mrs. Adams closed the door behind us and took a seat across from me. Her eyes were soft, but there was an underlying concern that made my stomach twist. "Tom," she began gently, "I've noticed you haven't been yourself lately. You seem distracted, almost distant. You're not participating in class like you used to. You're not yourself." I nodded, swallowing hard. I wanted to tell her everything, about the voices, the coldness, the way I felt like I was losing control. But the words wouldn't come out. Something held me back, an overwhelming fear that if I spoke, it would be too much for anyone to understand. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a small smile. "Just tired, I guess. It's a new school, new people. Maybe I'm just adjusting." Mrs. Adams didn't seem convinced. She studied me for a moment, her brow furrowing with concern. "I know moving to a new place can be hard, Tom, but this seems different." I've seen this kind of behavior before, not here, but in other schools. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. It's more than just stress, isn't it? I felt a chill run down my spine. How did she know? I had never spoken to her about anything beyond schoolwork. I tried to shake it off. I'm really fine, Mrs. Adams. Just give me some time to adjust. But Mrs. Adams wasn't convinced. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. Tom, I think something's wrong. And I think I know who can help. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Who could help? There's a woman I know, she continued. Her name is Mary. She's a psychic, she helps children who experience things they don't fully understand. I think you might need someone who can understand what you're going through. Maybe there's something more happening here than just being tired. We can find out, Tom. I blinked at her in confusion. A psychic? What was she talking about? But before I could say anything, she placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip firm but kind. You don't have to face this alone. You've been acting different, and I'm worried it's not just stress. I want to help you, Tom. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to deny it, to tell her that I was fine. That it was just some phase I would get through. But deep down, I knew she was right. Whatever was happening to me, it wasn't normal. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that I wasn't being pulled into something I couldn't control. I'll think about it, I said finally, my voice small. She gave me a small nod, as though she understood more than I was saying. I'll be here for you, Tom. We'll figure this out together. I walked home that day in a daze, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't make sense of. I didn't want to see a psychic. I didn't even believe in that sort of thing. But I knew, deep down, that I needed help. Something was wrong, something dark and dangerous, and it wasn't just in my head. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't the same person I had been a few weeks ago. Something was changing inside me. And it wasn't good. The next day, Mrs. Adams asked if I could meet someone after school. She didn't tell me who it was at first, but when I arrived at her office, I found a woman sitting there, her face calm and serene. She introduced herself as Mary. A psychic who had helped others in situations like mine. Tom, Mary said softly, looking me in the eyes with a warmth that made me feel safe, I know you're going through something difficult. You've been touched by something dark. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't deny it anymore. I felt it too. Mary told me she could sense a presence around me, a force that was slowly taking control. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as she spoke, and a part of me knew she was right. It's an evil spirit, she said. It's trying to possess you, Tom. I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't. The way she said it was so matter-of-fact, so sure, that I couldn't brush it off. Mary explained that the entity was old. Tied to the school. In fact, she said, it had been there for years. It was a teacher, once, she explained. A teacher who had been very cruel, and when she died, her spirit didn't leave. It remained behind, trapped in the very room where she had caused so much harm. Mrs. Adams, who had been quiet until now, looked at me gravely. The classroom you've been sitting in, room 12, was where she died. And ever since, students have been affected by her presence. She's been trying to possess the children, one by one. The air in the classroom was thick with tension as I stood there, my heart racing in my chest. Mrs. Adams and Mary had insisted that I remain calm, that everything would be okay as long as we performed the ritual correctly. But as we gathered near the locked door, I could feel the malevolent presence pressing in on me, the darkness swirling around me like a storm I couldn't escape. Mary had begun her chant again, her voice low and steady, the words flowing out in a rhythm I couldn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, the air turning colder with every passing moment. I could feel my skin prickling with the sense that someone, was watching me. The whispers, the voices I'd been hearing for weeks, seemed to grow louder, now piercing my thoughts in a chaotic swirl of threats and promises. They spoke to me, calling me by name, urging me to open the door. "Come closer, Tom. Let us in. You belong to us." I could feel myself swaying, my thoughts becoming increasingly muddled, as if the voices were trying to drown out everything else. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself, but my legs felt weak. The presence, the spirit, was so close now. I could almost see it, feel it in the very air. Just as I felt my control slipping, Mary's voice rang out, cutting through the noise like a beacon in the dark. "Tom, focus. Fight it," she commanded. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to center myself. I could feel the weight of something terrible pressing against my chest, but Mary's words were clear in my mind. I had to fight back. This wasn't just happening to me, it was happening to others before me, and it had to stop. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a low, echoing groan from behind the door. It was the sound of something ancient, something dead, and it sent a chill through my entire body. The door creaked, its hinges groaning under some unseen pressure, as though it was trying to push back against the force that Mary and Mrs. Adams were trying to exert. Then it happened. The door flew open, the force of it slamming against the wall with a violent bang. I stumbled back, my eyes wide with fear. There, in the doorway, stood a figure. She was tall, her face pale and gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to burn with malevolent energy. Her hair hung in matted strands around her shoulders, and her lips curled into a twisted smile. She wore old-fashioned clothing, a long black dress with a high collar, like something out of a different time. And as she stepped forward, I could feel the weight of her presence suffocating the very air around me. It was her, the teacher who had died in this very classroom years ago. "You can't escape me, Tom," she whispered in a voice that was both cold and rasping. Her eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and I felt the sudden urge to step forward, to let her in, but I knew I couldn't. Not again. The ghost's presence pressed into my mind, twisting my thoughts, trying to break my will. She wanted me, wanted my soul, wanted to take control of me. I could feel it, she was trying to possess me again. Just like before. My mind screamed at me to stop, to fight, but I felt so weak, so small in the face of her power. "Tom, focus." Mary's voice cut through the darkness again. I heard her chanting, louder now, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. With all the strength I had left, I fought back, pushing against the pull, against the suffocating grip the spirit had on me. I could feel my hands trembling, my body aching with the effort, but I couldn't give up. Not now. The ghost laughed, a cold, mocking sound, but as Mary continued chanting, I saw her expression change. The ghost staggered back, a look of frustration crossing her face. She was weakening. Her form flickered, becoming less solid, less real. Then, with one final, desperate howl, she began to fade. The room seemed to shake with her rage, but as Mary completed the final words of her chant, the presence in the room disappeared completely, leaving behind only a heavy silence. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, feeling the oppressive weight lift from my chest. It was over. The ghost was gone, but the victory didn't come without its cost. I looked up to see Mrs. Adams standing nearby. Her face pale but filled with relief. Mary was already kneeling beside me, her hand on my shoulder, whispering words of reassurance. "You're free, Tom," she said softly. "It's over now." The days following the ritual were filled with a sense of numbness and exhaustion. My body ached, as if I had run a marathon, and the mental toll of everything that had happened left me feeling drained. Even though the spirit had been banished, there was still a lingering feeling of unease, like I was waiting for something to happen. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the darkness to return, to reclaim me, but it never did. The school, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed brighter. The air in the classroom no longer felt heavy, and the whispers had stopped. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again, but I couldn't forget what had happened. I couldn't forget the way the ghost had looked, the way it had tried to take me. I still had nightmares about her, about the coldness in her eyes and the twisted, mocking smile she wore, when I finally returned to school, Mrs. Adams was there, waiting for me with a warm smile. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. I nodded, though the weight of the experience still hung over me. "Better," I said quietly. "It's over now." She nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. "Tom," she said softly, "I want you to know that you're not alone. What happened in that classroom, it's something I've seen before. The spirit of that teacher, she's been haunting children for years. No one knows why she stays, but she's hurt so many others before you. I don't want you to feel like you're the only one." I felt a lump form in my throat as I looked at her. She wasn't just a teacher anymore, she was someone who had protected me, who had tried to stop something terrible from happening. And I knew she cared, really cared, about what had happened to me. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you weren't the first. And you won't be the last." It hit me then, the full weight of what had happened. I wasn't the first victim, and I wouldn't be the last. But I had been lucky enough to have people who cared about me, people who had helped me when I needed it most. And for that, I would be forever grateful. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions of school, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that locked door, to the ghost that had haunted the classroom for so many years. I didn't know what had driven her to stay behind, to torment the children who came through that door. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let her hurt anyone else. As I left the school that afternoon, I looked back at the building one last time. The sun was setting behind it, casting long shadows across the playground. And for the first time, I felt peace. The evil was gone, and the door that had once been locked, once a gateway to fear and darkness, was now just a door. It's strange how quickly life can return to normal after something so impossible has happened. Just a few weeks ago, I had felt like I was losing myself to something dark, something terrifying. But now, I was free. The ghost was gone, and the weight that had pressed on my chest for so long was finally lifted. The school didn't feel like a prison anymore. In fact, I had started to enjoy going again, to see my friends, to join in on the lessons, even the games at recess. The weight of the supernatural had been replaced with the lightness of normalcy. For once, I felt like a regular kid again. Mrs. Adams checked in with me regularly. She seemed genuinely relieved that I was doing better. And every time I saw her, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward her. She had been there for me when no one else had understood, when no one else had known how to help. I didn't speak much about what had happened to anyone else. It wasn't something that could easily be explained. But every once in a while, when I walked past the classroom, I'd glance at the door at the back of the room, the one that had been locked for so long, and I'd remember what had happened. I'd remember the darkness that had tried to claim me, and the people who had helped me fight back. Some nights, when I lay in bed, I still thought about the ghost. I'd wonder why she had been so angry, so desperate to take control of me. But I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that she was gone now, and that whatever had once bound her to that room was broken. The darkness had lost, and with that,